Okay, take a roll. All right, so, oops, go away. Enable external content, that'll be good. Try that. Okay, so we're up to Hymenoptera. We've only got one other order to do, which is the Diptera of the flies. And Hymenoptera is a very interesting group, okay? So let's have a look at that to start with. Firstly, described species, 115,000, described 90 families worldwide, but because a lot of them are parasitic and not easy to find and know much about, we might have not twice as many, but we might have 5 times as many Hymenoptera out there, we're just not sure. We have 15,000 species in Australia, approximately 70 families, 3 only endemic. In Tasmania we've got approximately 50 families. Now the common name for these, there isn't a common name, and that's an interesting thing to think about. They're either called sawflies, bees, wasps or ants, okay? They don't really have a unifying feature that we might actually describe them by. So they've got no physical or biochemical characteristic, but what they do have, most interesting of all orders, is a lot of behavioural features that exist in the Hymenoptera and don't exist anywhere else. So we've got an evolution of behaviour within the Hymenoptera from single through to communal to social. Okay, and this is where the pinnacle of evolution sits in terms of that with social insects. Okay, so there is very interesting behaviours, and we'll use the behaviours to categorise them in terms of biology in the Hymenoptera. Here we can see again the evolution of the Hymenoptera. Probably a little bit later than some of the ones we've just done. So you can see here around 205 million years ago, but fairly large, fairly early on. Again, probably a large amount of parasitism and exploiting of resources through that. And again, the same sort of thing we can see here with the angiosperms and the radiation of many of them. We want to look here at the phylogeny relationships. Look at that. Not related to anything pretty much. It's out on its own. We've got something that's really at that pointy end of the whole phylogeny. So, and we'll go about why there is so much interesting things about Hymenoptera. So let's just have a bit of a wander through Hymenoptera from a sort of a public perception and general perception viewpoint. So the first perception that we generally see of wasps in particular is, and ants to an extent, you know, savage army ants, you know, blowing up. Custer's last stand actually stopped because there was a hornet circling above. So that angry, fierce, sort of protective, stinging thing is what we often think of when we're thinking of wasps and Hymenoptera. Even happens in cricket. One-day match against New South Wales, and looks like Victoria there had to hit the ground when a swarm of bees came across at North Sydney Oval. And as an interesting decision in cricket, Shaun Marsh in the South African Test Series was dropped. The keeper actually was stung by a bee at the exact moment he was dropped. So Shaun Marsh might have made more than one run in that particular circumstance. Okay. Want to get more fierce? Let's have a look at the Japanese hornet, or the Asian hornet. Invaded into, we've got European wasps, you think we're lucky. Invaded into China here, and you can see a gentleman with a nest. In 3 months killed 41 people. Okay, what happens if you're hit by these? You're multiple hits, you can get liver and kidney failure basically. So it gets pretty nasty. So yeah, there is obviously a reputation there with some of the wasp species. In terms of where we started with lecture 1, we had a look at a lot of these. We got the empire of the ants and them coming up from the underground after some nuclear problem. So, you know, ants invading, so there's the ants being pretty bad. The swarm, once Africanized honeybee, sort of escaped out of South America and up to North America. Of course, they had to make a movie out of it called The Swarm. It did star Michael Caine, who's in about every movie you could ever think of, but he did have the interesting comment to say that it was probably the worst movie he's ever been in. So that says something. And then we also went through to cartoons through the 90s and 2000s. Bug's Life, I mentioned about the hard-working ants being ripped off by the lazy grasshoppers. and turning it round a bit where we actually start to protect the ants from nasty people with ant bullies. So a few little approaches there in many different ways. This one here is just an interesting thing that the hornet, is often the name used, is often thought of as a mascot for a number of different teams. Now this happens to be at this stage the New Orleans Hornets. You can see there every team has a mascot and they're usually bad, and there's no exception with the Hornets basketball team. And there's some dubious looking fans. It's now reinvigorated. It went to the New Orleans Pelicans, which sounds very sad, and then it's come back in another franchise as the Charlotte Hornets, who are trying to get into the Eastern Conference final right as we speak, now close to that. So Hornets, but we can also see an Australian example here. This one was the Northern Bull Ants, which played in the VFL until they rearranged the VFL, and now they've got the misfortune of being aligned with Carlton, and they're not called the Northern Bull Ants anymore. Here we have a fighter. Front lee fighter jet is the F-18 Hornet. So again, the use of the word Hornet. And if we go to rugby league territory up in Queensland, there's a rugby league team known as the Orgathella Meat Ants, who are very proud of themselves, and they even have their own statue of the Orgathella Meat Ants in their local park. So a lot of them, but it's quite ironic that all these macho sort of teams, they're really, if we think about it, and we'll talk about it as we go through the lecture, they're basically sterile, non-reproducing females, are what the Hornets are. So the macho boys are probably not quite aligned with what they think they are. This one was another one that caused a little bit of an issue in a more local front here in Tasmania. This was part of a promotion program. We know how we have University Open Day. This is a decade or so back now, University Open Day, and all these pamphlets started to appear on our desks. And I took a look at the pamphlet. Oh, they're using bees, you know, be busy as a bee university. Then I took a look at the bee, promoting science, and said, hang on, that bee's only got one pair of wings. It's not a very good look for a bee, and its antennae are wrong too as well. So I rang up the marketing people here, who didn't really want to hear from me, and told them that it was all wrong, and that if they're promoting science, that's a pretty bad start. So they had to do some pretty quick overnight changes to some of the things they could to suddenly paint in a second pair of wings, and they remembered me for quite a long time, but marketing communication has huge turnover, so now I'm safe again and I'm all right in that space. Okay, let's have a look now at what is a Hymenoptera. Let's try to define a Hymenoptera and classification. Okay, adult Hymenoptera generally feed on nectar or honeydew. The mouth parts are typically chewing, except remember we had the bees with chewing lapping mouth parts. The antennae are long, multi-segmented, and frequently elbowed. So we can see them elbowed here in the honeybee, and they're certainly almost all elbowed in the ants, and quite a lot of the parasitic wasps as well. Not everyone, I mean we do see weevils, say, with an elbowed antenna as well, but the elbowing is really helpful to identify an ant, say, more than anything else. Their wings have a reduced venation, so not nearly as much as, say, a lacewing would have, or a butterfly if we could take it off, but their hind wings are always smaller than their forewings and hooked, and I'll show what that means in a minute. And the last one here is that fearsome thing that we talk about. They have a well-developed ovipositor. Okay, so here is some examples of some little parasitic wasps, and you can see definitely reduced venation. There's hardly a vein left in there, there's a little bit here. And you can see the difference between the fore and the hind wing in size. So that adds some weight to the comment that I just made. Here are our wings that are held together by hooks. You can see these little hooks here. We spoke about this when we spoke about flight and how coupling them together helps with being able to coordinate your flight a lot easier. And these are what these little hooks look like between the fore and the hind wings, or hamuli they're also called. Okay, let's have a look at the actual body form of wasps. Now we have two suborders, Symphyta and Apocrita. Symphyta includes the sawflies, Apocrita includes the ants, the bees, the wasps, most of the wasps. Some, obviously, sawflies are also wasps. But let's have a look. This is in the Symphyta. The one major characteristic of Symphyta is that they have what we call a thick waist. Okay, you can see that they don't have much of an hourglass shape here at all. So a thick waist on the Symphyta. Their larval stages have the head capsule like we see there, sometimes have prolegs, and they're feeding either on leaf foliage or on in wood, say like a Cyrex wood wasp. When we come to the Apocrita, they've done something really funky. They've actually taken their first abdominal segment and fused it into the thorax. So something known as propodium here. So this means it's not really a true thorax, it's called a mesosoma, which means this lot here is a metasoma. Okay? Well, what they have also done is they've taken the second and third abdominal segment and restricted them in size to this really, really tiny little waist here between the mesosoma and the metasoma. This little area, once you get beyond that waist, is called the gaster. Okay? Now we've got the waist. So we've got a metasoma, a mesosoma, a gaster. Okay, so that very restricted waist. The larvae of Apocrita don't look anything like this. They've got a very reduced head capsule. They're legless, okay, and they require their adults to look after them in some way. So you think of bees bringing food back to look after them in cells, predatory wasps looking after their offspring by bringing back prey, European wasps doing similar. So they're a pretty helpless thing, but they're not necessarily a bad thing. We'll talk about that in the wider context. If we have a look at this restricted waist, here we are with the European wasp, and we can see again gaster, metasoma, mesosoma. With ants, they have done a little bit more than that in terms of the, well, no, I guess it's just the way that they're actually define it. It's often called the alley trunk, and these little bits here between the second and third that are squeezed in here, they actually are sometimes characteristic by the number of nodules or little lumps they have on them in terms of that. And you can see the antenna here, this elbowed antenna here in the example of the ant there. Okay, ovipositor. So, it's well developed and modified. In the Symphyta, it deposits eggs through soaring into plant tissue because they're sawflies, so they're using that ovipositor as a soar into the mesophyll of the leaf tissue or the wood, and then depositing their eggs through there. However, remember when we looked at the reproductive system, we said they have an accessory gland, and in a lot of the Hymenoptera, that accessory gland produces a venom. Okay, so they have changed their ovipositor to enable to be used for defence. So for piercing hosts, so it can be used for as a parasitic wasp for getting inside a host, or secondarily developed just as a sting, as we see in this grouping known as a culeate wasp. So here we have a honeybee. She's just stung someone there. The poison sac is associated with that, and she'll die once she's done that. But wasps won't necessarily die. Wasps won't die. It's only the honeybee that dies after stinging, which is a very altruistic thing to do for your sisters and queen. Okay.
Do other bees die? Just honeybees?
No, just honeybees. Yeah. So yeah, social bees, bumblebees don't die. So yeah, it's a honeybee trait. With the hairs on the body, or the setae for bees, they're different to all other setae in the Hymenoptera and other groups in that they are actually branched or feather-like. So here is a number of scanning electron microscopes and pictures of 3D constructions of them. So you can see branched setae or hair-like setae, or branched or feather-like setae. And that obviously helps collect and keep the pollen on the body that they need as they're looking for pollen resources. If we go back to that table that we've looked at a couple of times now, we just look at Hymenoptera and we say, well, only 11% of them are herbivorous. So the majority of these are predators, okay, or eating meat in some way. Let's have a look at that. In the two suborders, the Symphyta, generally 4 to 8 instars. They're caterpillar-like, so a ruciform. You see that body shape there, the little keg on legs type approach, but not quite as fat as some of those little beetle larvae. Well-developed heads, chewing mouth parts, and fleshy abdominal prolegs. So really different looking to this, which is the Apocrita. There's a larvae of an Apocrita. So when you watch things like Bug Story and Dad's talking to his son ant looks exactly like Dad, but in fact his son should look something like this, which wouldn't be nearly as cute, would it? But anyway. So bees, wasps, ants have grub-like larvae, okay? They have a head. You can see there is still a head there, but it's very less well developed. They have chewing mouth parts still in there, but they're legless and eyeless, okay? And generally less than 5 instars rather than the 4 to 8 that we said with the Symphyta. So these things are helpless to an extent. They're really looked after by others in the sense, and we'll talk about that provisioning and social stuff as we go through. Parasitic wasps, those that actually attack others and live inside other insects, also have these Apocrita-like larvae, legless, etc. Their body form can be very highly reduced, lacking almost a clear head at all, eyes or appendages, so it can be very hard. Some of them have mandibles, and they use these mandibles for fighting off other parasitic larvae that may be inside their host in their early stages, and then lose their mandibles in their later stages. You can see here, there's not much here. Remember the respiration of these, they don't have sort of tracheal spiracles, they just absorb what oxygen they need through their, if you like, their exoskeleton or outer segments. In terms of parasitic, we'll get to talk about parasitic of other animals, but we do have a group, at least one group in the Hymenoptera, the cynnipids, the gall formers that form galls on plants, so they're parasitic, if you like, on plants. But if you remember what we said in previous lectures, galls could be formed by flies, they could be formed by wasps, they could be formed by Hymenoptera, they could be formed by thrips. There's quite a lot of groups, but we do have some that are gall formers in the Hymenoptera. Okay, so many larvae are provisioned or fed by adults in the Hymenoptera. So in this case here, we've got a female who's got a caterpillar, and she's going to take that off to a nest that she's developed and put it down there and lay eggs on it to provision it for her hosts. So wasps are eating meat in one form or other. Bees are typically pollen or honey. So here we have a bumblebee feeding larvae here, and pollen and honey is used for both the adults and the larvae. Pollen being the protein, honey being the carbohydrate. We do have one group of wasps that does actually also exploit pollen. But on the whole, meat for wasps, pollen and honey for bees. Aspects of the general biology that I'd like to mention include only a few things. So haplodiploidy we've spoken about already in our earlier lectures around insect reproduction, which is, remember, you have a choice whether you want a son or a daughter. If you choose to fertilise that egg, then it's diploid and it will be a female. If you don't fertilise it, then it's haploid and it will be a male. Okay, so sex determination is quite interesting in Hymenoptera. Let's have a look at a biological classification. Remember I said behaviour is important, so let's have a look at the sort of behaviours that we can get to getting a biological classification. So we have our first group, the Symphyta, the sawflies. Then we have within the Apocrita parasitic wasps, predatory wasps, which are known as the aculeate antisocial species. So 4 groupings. So let's have a quick look through some of those. The first one being the phytophages or leaf feeders or plant feeders, being the sawflies. This is the one of the more common ones that you're going to come across here, which is the steel blue sawfly larvae, spitfires, well known as. They will be found on eucalyptus trees around sort of this time of year as well, maybe a bit earlier too. and they will ball together in the daytime and then move out and feed at night. What you probably were not so aware of and think that they might be, that they are Hymenoptera, they are sawflies. This is what the adult looks like. Really nice looking thing, an adult sawfly. So this is the adult of that species, the steel blue sawfly. And she has that ovipositor, which she oviposits into the mesophyll of the leaf with her saw-like ovipositor, sawfly. Okay, then we move on to another really interesting group, and one of my favourite groups again, the parasitic wasps, or the parasitoids. It's a term I want you to understand. It's not like having a tapeworm in you, it's slightly different. So a parasitoid, the larvae or the immature develops by feeding on the body of another and must kill it in order to complete its development. Okay? The adults are generally free living. So if you've got a tapeworm, yeah, you're going to have a tapeworm for a whole lot of time, might reproduce, etc., but it's not going to kill you. Okay? If you've got a parasitoid inside you, you're going to die. Okay? If you can't overcome it. So it's, in order to complete its development, it's going to kill you. And it's going to do that in a very specific way, because it's got to have an interaction or a relationship with its hosts to be able to develop inside it. So they're really, really great biocontrol agents because of that. Okay, let's have a look at a few parasitoids here to give you a couple of ideas in a few of the families and a bit where the idea of parasitoids has gone in the wider public. So this is an egg parasitoid. This is a species known as Inogera nausii. I can't give you a common name for it, but it's attacking here. You can see it's ovipositor drilling into a leaf beetle egg. So this one, we worked on a classical biocontrol program with New Zealand for a leaf beetle species, the Australian one they got in there, and that was introduced in early 2000s into New Zealand. This one here I've also worked on with New Zealand, and this is a parasitoid of the gumleaf skeletonizer. In this case it's not an egg parasitoid, but it's a larval parasitoid. So it's attacking the larvae and emerging from the larvae. Egg parasitoids are really good because nothing's happened, you kill them before they start to feed on anything, but larval can also supplement and do well in any sort of biocontrol situation. So this one we introduced into New Zealand after 8 years of work in 2011. Has done really well and moved through a lot of New Zealand. This is what happens. Basically, if you're a caterpillar attacked by one of these parasitoids, you can see it bursting out the side there, really big, and spinning a cocoon, and notice that cocoon has silk on it. It wouldn't be a beetle, it's got silk, so Lepidoptera, Hymenoptera, we're thinking in that case there. We want to think about this sort of situation, and we can get pupal parasitoids and larval pupal. We get a number of different options. But if we want to think about this in a more wider public sense, this is the movie Aliens. So I'll start the movie going down here because it goes on for a little bit. It has two stages. It has a face hugger which puts something down inside the unsuspecting crew member, and then it has the next stage, which is what we saw in that caterpillar, which is the chest burster, which is about to happen here on the screen for you as it comes out of the unsuspecting crew member. So totally taken off Hymenoptera and parasitoid life cycle. I think this is about it. I can't advance these, unfortunately, but you get the general impression of what about advance doing. Chest burster. There it is. Cute. Alright. Okay. So, a few families. So if you're a caterpillar out there in Earth, you're going to be suffering aliens all the time. And these are some of the big groups that have been used in biocontrol. This one's ichthyomonids. Okay, so these are really good parasitoids of most polymetabolous insect larvae, a lot of Lepidoptera in particular. No common name, sorry, we don't have them for some of these. Braconids, another really fantastic biocontrol group and family. These ones are really good biocontrol agents, not only Lepidoptera larvae, but also beetle larvae, and also quite useful in Hymenoptera control. So Braconids are a really good group. Inserteds is another one of the big biocontrol families, and the services these things do are innumerable. A lot of scale insects are controlled by inserteds, which get around the world quite easily being scale insects. So there's been a lot of biocontrol programs using inserteds to get around scale insects in particular. And this is one of the cutest and biggest ones. In fact, I've got lots of live ones down in the lab at the moment, but they're so tiny, I don't think I can really show them to you very well here. But it's trichogrammatidae, which are egg parasitoids. There's probably about 6 species of these. We're used ubiquitously around the world for controlling particularly caterpillar larvae. So you can see it here parasitising that egg, and you can get 2 or 3 species, 2 or 3 individuals coming out of one egg, and here they are both parasitising eggs as the ovipositor going down. Well, you can't actually see it in this one, very clear. So another really, really good beneficial group. Okay, so we've got away from parasitoids and aliens. Now we're going to move into predatory wasps. So if you're not going to be eaten from the inside, you might be taken to someone else's house from the outside. So aculeates. So we've got 2 types that we want to look at. You don't build a nest, or you build a nest. Okay, so the no nest sort are the cuckoo wasps. Now we're familiar with cuckoos in the bird sense, which a cuckoo bird comes along and puts an egg into a nest, and that offspring kicks out the other ones and gets fed by the mother bird, even though she's not related, and eventually becomes the one. Well, the cuckoo wasps have a very similar thing. They go along and they look for, in this case here, this is like a social bee that has a pollen reserve there. It'll look for that, it'll lay its egg in there, exploit the nests of others, and then end up actually taking over that and killing the host in the end that would be there. So cuckoo wasps are exactly like you think of a cuckoo bird. So they're not really making any sort of nest at all. They're just finding something with a good food resource and taking over that food resource in the way that they do it. Okay, then we have 3 types of nest builders, and I'm going to have a slide or 2 for each of those. The first type we have is a squatter. Okay, you find something that looks like a good hole or crevice already around, you take it over, like squatting in housing, So particularly things that are left behind by things like wood boring beetles and other things like that, good place to squat. Okay, so here's an example of a squatter. A lot of solitary bees are squatters, so they'll find like bits in between the mortar on bricks and things like that, and then they'll use that and they'll provision that with a lot of pollen, lay some eggs in there, and let their offspring develop. Not only solitary bees, there are wasp species as well. The squatters, and this is a great example of something in the public eye at the moment of a squatter. And you've just heard of the 2 airline disasters in Ethiopia and Indonesia. This is one that nearly came about in Australia, the Malaysia Airlines flight. And what happens in, there is a thing called the pitot gauge in airliners, which is just around this area here, which is a small little opening, and what it does is actually measures the airspeed of the plane in flight, so it's coming through there. Well, it also happens that these look like a great place to squat for a wasp, okay? Well, to actually nest for a wasp. So you squat them in, so you can see here a wasp has come along, you block those things up, you get no proper readings from the airspeed gauge at all. So when they come into places like Brisbane Airport, they cover them with a little cover over the top of them to stop it getting taken over by a wasp, which they forgot to take off the plastic cover when that airline took off. It is purported to be also an issue in other areas of the world in Asia where they have had some problems, near fatality problems. So squatting, try not to squat on aeroplanes. Builders. Builders, so you're going to build something yourself. There are various species who create a nest from materials, could be mud or other sorts of materials, typically mud, commonly known as potter or mason wasps. And I've got some, no, I've only got the one picture here of this one, but these builders, so here is potter wasps, these are them here, this is my screenshot at the moment on my computer, picking up mud. Here you can see lots of mud, and they bring them back and produce, in this case this would be, no, they're solitary species. They would produce a mud nest here, And this wasp, she'll go along and she'll collect, typically it's spiders, lots and lots of spiders, and provision them down the hole there. She has a certain number she needs to collect. Then she'll lay her eggs in there. These are all paralysed, nice and fresh. And then she'll leave and they'll feed on the paralysed spiders and eventually emerge. There was an interesting paper over 20 years back now that looked at the ability of these, which are quite common in northern Australia, to help date Aboriginal rock art, because you can actually date and look at the pollen and some of the mud over it, and then look at that date versus what you think might be behind that they've actually put them on. And it is a bit of a problem because they tend to put their mud nests all over the Aboriginal rock art too. Okay, the last option then is being a digger. Okay, so in that case you're going to dig a hole in the ground for the nest. If you do that, you're often again interested in spiders, but in this case we've got a fly here. So this is one of my wasps I've worked on, the tarantula hawk wasp, dragging a tarantula back. She will dug a hole into the ground. Here's another one, pompillid for digger wasps, and another one here. So they've dug this hole and then they'll throw that down in that hole and then fill it up again afterwards, after they've put the appropriate number of paralysed prey in there. So we've got three types, if you remember now: the squatters, the builders and the diggers. Okay, then we move up. We go, whoa, we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to work together. We're going to get to being social. So social species is the next advancement that we've got, and really is the pinnacle, if you like, of behavioural evolution. What is a social species? These are defined. They're present in ants and bees and some wasps. Three traits actually define a social species. The first of those is division of labour. So not everyone's doing exactly the same thing. Generally they have a caste system. They might have, in the case of they have soldiers, in the case of ants they have workers, and they'll have queens, but a caste system, and within that caste they will have certain roles at certain times, like a worker honeybee for a certain period of life will work inside the hive, nursing and doing other things, then she'll move outside and start doing foraging. So there is division within any one caste as well, but they're sterile individuals, they're not reproducing, okay? So only the queen is doing the reproduction. The second thing is that we get cooperation among colony members in tending to the young. So you have those helpless little apocrita larvae that we see there. We need some cooperation there to look after the young. And the third one is we have an overlap of generations capable of contributing to colony function. So this helps in that you can actually get the overlap so that you can get learning, if you like, going on between older and younger generations. So effectively you're able to do things in parallel. So instead of, if you're an individual, you have to go do the nesting and then the cleaning and then you have to vacuum the house and do everything else. But you can have lots of them doing all things at once. So when you're working in parallel, it works really, really well. Okay, so this is an example of a social species. Not the pinnacle of that, but it's the vespids or the paper wasps, and we can see here there would be a queen that would have established that, and she'll build a number of cells and then produce daughters, and then those daughters will do the work for the queen while she then lays more eggs. In this case here we have ants, and the ants are all social species, okay? So in the ants everything's social, and again it's sterile females that are doing all the work. This is one of my favourite ant species in North Queensland, which is the green tree ant. So it actually doesn't have a nest in the ground, it nests in the trees. It's an acacia tree that it's built, and it actually, they all line up, you can watch them all line up and slowly pull the leaves together, and then they'll start spinning silk to try and keep those leaves together. So green tree ants, but they're also a favourite food item of the Indigenous people up in that area, because they have a really sugary sweet abdomen. So they're like a native form of lemonade when you crush them into water. Okay, if we're getting up to really, really interesting social insects, we're looking at bees as well. And this one's the honeybee. We've got the bumblebee in other forms. And the slight difference is the honeybee, say, has a colony for all of the time, whereas things like European wasp and bumblebees build up a colony, then it all collapses before winter, then the queens overwinter somewhere, come out again, build up another colony, etc. So these ones are continuous with honeybees, which is why they're so good for cropping situations. You don't have to have them collapsing and you get large numbers of individuals. We do have some social bees in Australia. We have 10 social bees. They're pretty much stingless, so that would be wonderful with working with a stingless bee, but they're not very good for honey or any real thing. But we don't have any in Tasmania, not any social. So every native bee we have is a solitary bee species. So unfortunately not much to be gained from our native bees for honey production or use in cropping situations. They do rear, there's 1 or 2 stingless bees that they rear, particularly in council areas in Sydney and Brisbane. People keep a little stingless bee hive. They can get a little bit of honey out of them, but it's more of a hobbyist thing than it is actually a practical thing. Okay, let's look at economic significance. Okay, so we've already said, and there's probably there is no other order. The Hymenoptera would have to be the most beneficial order of all insect orders, the beneficial grouping, for a lot of reasons. One of those is their role in biological control, not only in managed biological control, but just out there in the environment, cleaning up and killing and controlling a lot of different things out in the environment and ecosystems out there. So being a parasitoid or predatory, really important in biological control. Important in pollination, I put a little quirky one in here first, which is fig wasps, where the fig is actually a flower. Internally there are a lot of flowers. These little fig wasps get into the flower through here, and the fig wasps are involved with pollination of all figs. I think there's over 50 species of fig around the world, although ones that commercially are produced are not requiring of that through breeding purposes. But they're pretty interesting life cycle that goes pretty much entirely inside the fig. So you're eating basically immature wasp larvae inside figs. This is an example, and honeybees have certainly been in the news for probably 4 or 5 years now, of what your product choices might be like with and without honeybees. So with honeybees, we're looking at about 35% of all we grow being it's dependent on honeybees. Certainly a lot of fruits, and a lot more than that actually overall has some benefit from honeybee pollination. So really, really important for producing fruits, and some of the pastures require clover, for instance, also benefits from pollination. It's not only just pollination per se, it's the shape of the fruit is better through pollination, and the quality and longevity of the fruit seems to be improved through proper pollination practices from things like honeybees. So pretty important. This one here is some work. We actually work quite a bit now on honeybees. You can see some of these have I'll put a little video going here in the background. These have little tags on them. So we're working with them at the moment to try and look better at the impacts of some sort of miticides and insecticides on honeybee foraging. And with these little tags, we've actually got a smaller tag now. This is a very early prototype. This is a new prototype, where you can see they're all going in the right way at last, which is a hard job to get bees to go the right way because they're pretty smart. But then we are looking at their foraging behaviour through this and looking at stresses on them for foraging. Whoops. Okay, so there are some bad things we have to say as well. There's always going to be some. Some of your leaf, wood and seed feeding Hymenoptera might be a problem. We'll go through one of those in a while when we talk about pests. We get parasitoids of parasitoids, so we get hyperparasitoids. So they're going to interrupt any sort of biological control program that we might be interested in. And social insects have become invaders in a large way all around the world. So that's an interesting one with social insects and invasion, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So here is Russell approaching the hornet's nest, but his timing is particularly bad because it's angry hour between 4 and 5. So they are pretty fierce, and we've got a lot of invasive species in Australia. The European wasp is one of those. We've also found in the last 10 years that there's also the English wasp, which is very similar, that is invaded, and we'll show you those in the lab, how to tell the two apart. We have bumblebees which have invaded in here. We have Argentine ants that have invaded. If you go up to Queensland, we've got fire ants. If you go to Christmas Island, we've got crazy ants and the crab situation there. You go there are other ant species, tramp ants, right through the Northern Territory. So they have done very well as invasive species. Why might that be so? These are my list of things that are important as to why they have become very invasive social species. First of all, the queen. She can store her sperm for a long time, and she can live a long time, years, you know. She overwinters, and we talk about those species like bumblebees that collapse over winter. They spend a time in a sort of a rested state, you know, under bark and things in trees over winter. So that means they can get around pretty well on shipping and planes and other containers. And they also have haplodiploidy, which we've spoken about before, but it does look like, and we did a study on the genetics of the bumblebees here with a Swiss group, that it helps purge out deleterious genes, because when they're haploid, they're expressed. They're not diploid, they're not masked in a heterozygous state. So they're expressed, therefore you get purging of deleterious genes quite quickly with haplodiploidy. Getting access to insects for control. Okay, you've got generally a nest, say an ant's nest underground or a bee's nest or something like that to get to them. You're not going to get to the queen too easy, and you're not even going to get to a lot of the workers. So for an Argentine ant's nest, only 5 to 7% of the ants are actually up and foraging around at any one time. Spray them, that's not going to do a lot, is it? You've actually got to get access down into the nest to all the young, the immatures, which are hidden and protected, and eventually to the queen. Efficient division of labour. So once you've got into a place, and you can partition your labour, if you're really short on food resources, when you've invaded a new place, you can actually allocate more and more to that rather than to internal nest sort of things. So you can divide labour into what's needed very quickly. And you can also locate food with a lot more foraging out there and monopolise it. So I know that we were doing some work with the police up in northern Tasmania a few years back, trying to look at some pig carcasses for forensic work that they were involved with, and that was just being totally monopolised by European wasps. They were just taking away every maggot that came there at one time. So they can really just dominate an area. The number of individuals. I think some of the ant species, I think it's the white-footed ant, is it? About 7 million individuals in an ant's nest. So there's a hell of a lot there. Bees, 60,000 species, 60,000 individuals in a bee nest, for instance. And then coupled with that, you can defend it. So they're quite interested in defending it, obviously for good reasons. So they have the venom that they can sting and defend. They're really protective of the reproductives. So the best way to get access to an invasive social species is to try and develop a bait that you can actually develop that the foraging workers will take down to the nest, get through the nest and to the queen. But they also have like tasters in there that actually taste it rather than sending it to the queen first. And for instance, with Argentine ant, I know that when they started doing the work on that, they tried 4,000 different chemicals, and there's only 3 that they'd actually take down and get access to the queen through that sort of thing. So they're really good at protection of reproductives. So a lot of reasons there, but they're very good invasive species. Let's just have a look at 2 case studies I want to do in the last 5 or 6 minutes. So the first one is one of those symphyta, the Syrex wood wasp. It attacks pine trees, particularly Pinus radiata, California pine trees, and it was first found in Tasmania in 1952. Okay, and it will have a significant problem. It came probably from New Zealand. Its native range, as you can see here, is right through most of Europe and a little bit of northern Africa, but it has invaded Australia, it has invaded New Zealand, it has invaded South Africa. It has, in 2005, got into the west coast, northeast coast of America, so North America, and it's also invaded a number of countries in South America, being Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. So it's got around from there and threatening to a lot of pine, freestanding pine. And particularly interesting issue here because Pinus radiata, the one that we use everywhere, is not a very common species anymore in California. So, you know, you could get into the remaining true stands of Pinus radiata. This is what it looks like if you get attacked by Cyrex wood wasp. You can see all the damage on the outside of the tree here from all the puncturing and larval feeding, and then you get deaths of stands. So if your stands are a little bit susceptible through poor thinning or being too dense, any mechanical damage, they're in there like a shot to try and get into it. They have a symbiotic fungi. We mentioned that in the earlier lectures on feeding and reproduction, which we often need to break down wood and cellulose. So that symbiotic fungi is with them, and here we can see them in the tunnels moving through, and you can see stands here with emergence holes of Cyrex wood wasps. Tasmania actually initiated and did most of the early work on the biocontrol through the 50s and the 60s when we had an entomology group down here with CSIRO and Battery Point. They introduced a number of biocontrol agents. We've got those present in the collection, which we'll show you tomorrow as well. All of them have enormously long ovipositors, obviously to get access to the Cyrex wood wasp larvae. As you can see them there, but the one that really turned out to be most good for biocontrol was a nematode. And this is like a little nematode formula in that sauce bottle there. They knock down poor timber and then inject it with the sauce bottle with nematodes. Then a female wasp would come along, think, oh, this is a great place to put a few larvae in, start to lay in that, and the nematodes will get into the reproductive system of the female wasp. And then she transports it around to other trees, so these nematodes are getting present in a lot of trees, and it's a really good biocontrol for them, and this has been used around the world now for biocontrol. There are issues with strains of nematodes and some less pathogenic strains dominating ones that we like, more pathogenic, but it's been a really great example of a nematode being used in biological control. This is the last one I want to mention, the European wasp. And again, like Cyrex, which I believe did come from New Zealand, European wasp has come to Australia via New Zealand as well. The first one is the species known as European wasp came into Tasmania in 1959, so we were the first point, and then it moved from Tasmania onto the mainland, and we now have another species, as I've already said, known as the English wasp, which we realised is very similar but is also here as well. This is the life cycle of European wasp. It's a social species. She's going to build a nest. She's going to look for some sort of crevice or cavity or old rat's nest or something like that she can get into, walls, timbers, roofing, and she'll start to lay here, and then you can see all the more cells that she builds up with time for workers in here right through to getting a very large nest. So you can get extraordinary large nests, and the problem we may be perceiving, get down here more, and this is about the time of year you're going to start to get harassed by them because at autumn they're at their largest. Before they crash for winter. And then the other problem is that if the winter has been very mild, they might be able to survive that winter still as a colony, and then they get even larger again. So we've got potential issues with these. What they're after basically protein and carbohydrate. So any sugary solution here, like this raspberry, and also meat. And here is a nest that we've taken out of an area. But this is one of the things more immediately in an agricultural sense that is a concern, the relationship between large numbers of European wasps being present and the grape harvest season, not only damaging, as you can see there, damaging grapes, and then allowing not only the damage but also fungal pathogens to get in, but also harassing obviously workers and other things like that. So we do have baits that we can use, but there is no commercial bait as yet. We know of the secret formulas that we can use, and they are, I think, managed by one of the winery associations at the moment. You can get baits off them. That's the best way to try and control them. The other thing that I wanted to mention about this is that it's not just, getting into your Coca-Cola can and everything else. They actually have a very significant impact, like Argentine ants, a lot of these invaders do, like they have with crabs on Christmas Island. on the native fauna. So this is my Photoshop version of that I found of what they're doing, and basically in New Zealand they've been doing a lot of work, and they've seen numbers up to 10,000 foraging European wasps in a hectare there, and they're absolutely cleaning out the invertebrate fauna in those areas. So it is, you know, a wider, more environmental serious problem as much as it is a nuisance and an issue for us. And I believe that's where I finish.
So how did you tell about this rock?
We'll show you in the lab. It's to do the markings on them.